Welcome to Radio Makua, a people-centered podcast. I'm your host, Dinga Sikwebu. Today's episode aims to contextualize the debates and conversations on just energy transition and climate change. This episode is part of a limited series on green hydrogen, produced by the mining-affected communities United in Action and Women Affected by Mining United in Action, Makua and Wamua for short. This is a social justice movement that has a stronghold and organizes communities affected by mining activities in South Africa. This series is a powerful tool crafted by marginalized mining communities who are in the frontiers of climate change, the energy transition, and the struggles against exploitative mining practices. It represents a radical, bottom-up approach where these communities lead the process using their lived experiences to drive understanding and action around green hydrogen and the issues that affect their futures. Coming up in this episode, we find out more about climate change and the importance of justice in transitioning to greener forms of energy.
In a situation where you have millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't have access to clean energy sources. People still use biomass, cow dung as for energy. Clearly the demand is not to move from fossil fuels to renewables. The questions of
almost every part of the world's economy is dependent on the burning of fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil. These fossils then release greenhouse gases that make the earth to be warmer. We live in a time of rising planetary temperature, unpredictable weather, rising sea levels, drought, and floods and climate change-induced deaths. While everyone is affected by human-induced climate change, its impacts run deeper, further entrenching existing socio-economic inequalities and widening the gap between people and nations. It is marginalized communities in the global south that bear the devastating consequence of climate change. Livelihoods have been completely destroyed in places like Mozambique and Nepal, to mention just a few. Efforts to help the global south with adaptability have often been negligible as they are not premised on justice. As a way to mitigate this, multilateral organizations, grassroots movements, organized labor, captains of industry must face each other to have an expansive, nuanced, and inclusive conceptualization of climate justice. We look into the current state of climate justice. We delve deeper into the historical origins of the concept of climate justice and how it has entered mainstream debates as the world moves away from fossil fuels. Sharing insights with us is a retired labor unionist and activist of many years.
My name is Dinga Sikwebu. I work part-time for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is a German political foundation linked to the Green Party in Germany.
My conversation with the veteran activist and scholar began with him giving an analysis of where we are in terms of climate change crisis.
If you take what the scientists are saying, there is sufficient consensus that climate change is here. The International Panel on Climate Change, called the IPCC, which is a huge network of scientists, have produced reports that show that fossil fuel and the burning of fossil fuel is leading to the warming of the planet. Unlike 10 years ago, where there was a strong denialism, I think the science has shifted things in significant ways, pointing to the link between human-induced climate change and the use of fossil fuels. So from a science point of view, I think that there's ample evidence to show that climate change is here. But if one looks at the effects, I think even ordinary people can see that we are experiencing climate shocks, extreme weather patterns, heat waves, floods, and I think that it's both from the science angle and from what people are experiencing in their daily lives. I would say there's been a pushback on the denialism that we had, I would say, a decade ago.
I want us to just speak on some of the resistance, which who is at the core of the resistance of the transition, and what has been the role also of organized communities and labor in the conversation about the transition, and what are some of the players that are at the core of resisting change, and those that are thinking of transitioning. In what ways are they balancing all the competing interests?
First thing, what one would say is that for a number of years, the evidence was there that fossil fuel, oil, natural gas, these as energy sources were causing global warming. And this view was suppressed by fossil fuel companies. The fossil fuel industry went on an offensive to disprove and propagate that this was not true. So the resistance came from the fossil fuel industry and the governments that are aligned to the fossil fuel industry. And I think it's important when we talk about the fossil fuel industry, we're not talking about the companies that mine coal or oil companies or gas companies. These industries have been able to form a complex where there are interlocking relations. Take oil. There are companies that do the exploration. There are the companies that do the drilling. There are companies, shipping companies that do the transporting. There are lawyers who do the contracts. So we're talking here of a very big, I would say, industrial complex. The other important thing which sometimes people don't talk about is how the military machine, that's now the military industry, is a big emitter of greenhouse gases. And interestingly, when they negotiated the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the military is excluded. So if you're talking about what's happening in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if you're talking about the onslaught and the war on the Palestinian people, and you think of the fossil fuel that are driving these wars and the emissions that come from that, what they done by setting up think tanks that were to discredit any talk about climate change, global warming. There's been an attempt to say that the industry wants to move. So you have a sort of oil companies beginning to position themselves as now energy companies and going beyond the fossil fuel and ensuring that their portfolios are wider than just focusing on fossil fuels. And a company like British Petroleum, BP, is now beyond petroleum. And they're all talking about just transition. And what has happened within this sort of United Nations system, corporations have also come together at a global level to talk about the energy transition. And they are interacting with the UN system to the extent that when the conference of parties take place, the biggest delegations that come to these conferences are not representatives of elected representative or people from organizations or even states. It is the corporates, and they have organized themselves, and people are talking about how corporates are capturing the UN system in a big way, and then this has sort of raised questions about how genuine is this, and this is what has led some people within civil society to say, is this a genuine treatment of the issue, or is this greenwashing, and that these companies are ensuring that they have a place in what is a post-carbon future.
And I think it's the perfect time just to touch on that aspect, but also the idea of a just transition, right? What is it, and where does it come from? Does it come from the very analysis that you've just given?
I mean, the idea of a just transition comes from the labor movement. The concept of a just transition was formulated by trade unions in North America in the 70s. And what was happening in the 70s in North America and the US in particular is that because of environmental protection, the rise of environmentalism, the government in the US was strengthening environmental protection. And companies, instead of complying with the environmental laws and regulations, mainly in the chemical industry, were deciding to relocate to the South, the southern states of the US. Now, if you understand the history and the politics of the United States, it is in the southern states where Black people and Afro-Americans live. Interestingly, it is also in these states that you had the lowest union membership or union density. So the companies, instead of complying, were closing shop and moving to the southern states or even relocating outside of the US. And the unions in North America, and here it was a union called the Oil and Chemical Workers Union, coined the idea of a just transition. That if there is going to be a transition to an environmentally compliant system, this must not be a burden that workers will have to carry. And they came up with the idea of a just transition. There is then what I call the second coming of the concept, because this was in the 70s and it was responding not to energy, but to greater environmental protection. After the Rio conference, which is where the discussion took place on climate change and global warming in 1992, the union movement went back to this idea of a just transition. The international trade union movement said, look, if we're going to transition from use of fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, we need a just transition. So they borrowed an old concept of the 70s and put it into the discourse on climate change.
In us, for instance, thinking of transitioning and making sure that what workers are putting forward is done. So the idea of transitioning without justice, because I think what people on the ground are saying that this thing is not just, it's a top-down approach from, from states and corporates. So in what ways does this represent these tensions and different interests?
Interpretations of just transition can be categorized into three. Firstly, there is what can be called a win-win situation, business as usual. By that, it's if we transition, everyone is gonna win. So many companies that say, look, with the problems of climate change and global warming, if we move to greener technologies, green economy, we will make a profit, and there will be new jobs in the green economy, and the companies will win, and workers will win, and therefore this is the best opportunity for all parties. So that is a win-win interpretation of the sort of just transition. So people that say, look, it will be just, and we just have got to ensure that we move into the green economy, and there will be green jobs, and we all win. And in the main, this is what corporations, companies advocate. There is the second interpretation of the just transition that say with the energy transition, there would be some losers. The fossil fuel workers, the jobs will be lost, and there will be winners. New companies in the renewable energy space will be winners. So with winners and losers being there, what you need and require is a just transition. And just transition, we must ensure that the workers are reskilled, the social security, and all other measures for those who will fall out of the system. That is the second, I would say, interpretation. And people then attach a certain interpretation of just transition to this trajectory. The third one says that we are in this problem because of corporation, capital, chasing profits. The use of fossil fuel was there to ensure that the profit motive is realized. And that energy and fossil fuel are so integral in the process of capital accumulation. And if you want an energy transition, you have to change the system itself. And which is why there are calls for a systems change. And this is, people would argue, is a transformative interpretation of just transition. That it's not just training a few workers. It's not just ensuring that those who lose jobs will have some social security or packages. Is that to be able to ensure that we deal with climate change and global warming, the whole economic system needs to be changed. And that is the only way that you can ensure that there is a just transition. So the just transition has become a very contested concept. Interpretation one is where just transition and the shift in energy system is just moving to a new accumulation system or a system of making money. The second one recognizes that they're losers, but you need to ensure that those who are affected are not affected in adverse ways, and you create mechanism of compensating them, of protecting them. And the third one is a more calls for deeper transformation. So that's where things are at in terms of the use of the concept.
So it's a very interesting contestation, and because I guess my where I'm at with the concept of trying to also tease out is this is not a concession where there has been a demand and then there's concession. It's there in policy. Or it has also the effect of demobilization, right? So in a sense that it might be seen from others that we have considered that we need to do this transition in a just way, as it has been demanded. But the effect of that, because it's clear that the interest of capital is being put at the center of it, and communities are being left behind, that actually other people then might stop agitating for it because it has that demobilizing effect.
It is important for working class people, communities, to claim their victories. We are here because many years ago, movements said there is a problem of climate change. There was a lot of denialism, pooping that and say, look, that's not the case. You don't know what you're talking about. It's become difficult for denialists to sustain their position at the moment. Now, that is a victory to the movements. And I do sometimes think that the talk about, this is greenwashing and capture of our demands can be in itself demobilizing, because you are not acknowledging the agency that led to the situation where states at various levels, multilateral, regional, nation states, subnational levels, are engaging with the issue of the energy transition and climate change. My view is always that we are here and people are talking about climate change, global warming, because of the movements. When I'm in workshops and we discuss this, I always say to people, one of the trade union leaders warned the union movement that it mustn't act like a baboon that goes into a millie field and it takes a millie cob and it puts it here, and then it takes another one, it puts it here, but it says, another one, and then it wants to grab, and the one that's under the armpit falls away. We have to find ways of consolidating the victories. So that is my starting point, that all this talk about climate change, just transition, it's because it came from below. The second thing I want to say, acknowledging that it came from below, it must be celebrated, is that yes, it has been taken. There are attempts to give it a different interpretation, and we have to be careful of that. We've got to be vigilant and ensure that a working class community interpretation of energy transition is maintained. And when we do that, we've got to look at certain maybe weaknesses even in the way we introduced it. And my view is that the concept having come from below, there were certain weaknesses. For an example, the second coming of the just transition, which tied it to climate change negotiations, had a northern, I would say, Eurocentric approach. For countries in Europe and North America, an energy transition means moving from fossil fuel to renewable energy. It's a horizontal shift. In a situation where you have millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't have access to clean energy sources. People still use biomass, cow dung, as for for energy. Clearly there, the demand is not to move from fossil fuels to renewables. The questions of energy poverty are issues that need to be addressed. And I think that in the second coming of the just transition as a concept, issues of energy poverty, as an example, were not factored in. And that if we have to reclaim the concept and ensure that it has a radical meaning, or not radical for the sake of being radical, but it appeals to and it addresses interests of billions who don't have access to clean energy sources. The issues of energy poverty will have to be factored in.
I want us to go on the South African context, particularly the renewable energy, and in context of energy poverty that you mentioned. In the past few years, we've been battling load shedding, and there's been a lot of conversation and debate and dialogues around transitioning, and South Africa has committed itself to do so. Where are we, and how do you see, this process? Our communities, included, are part of this conversation, and is just transition, expressing the dead element. Is it challenging the system? Is it systematic and transformative in its way that it's been implemented in our context?
I mean, the idea of a just transition, as it happened internationally. In South Africa, the idea of a just transition came from the labor movement. It is the labor movement that said climate change is here and we need a energy transition, but that energy transition must be just. So in 2009, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, began to talk about climate change and the need for a just transition. 2011, it adopted principles on climate change and the labor movement, and those principles included the idea of a just transition. Yeah, again, this was a demand, I would say, from below. I mean, where we are now in South Africa, we have a cabinet-approved framework on just transition. There are big debates on where this framework sits in terms of the three interpretation. Is it business as usual, win-win? Is it the one that recognizes winners and losers? Or is it the sort of transformative, deep transition? My view is that clearly the framework in South Africa recognizes that there will be losers and that there's a need to do something to cushion the losers. I think that there are sprinklings of the need to look at how the system is structured, and here and there there's a talk about exploring different models of ownership. And I would say maybe it's within interpretation two with elements of three. And clearly the people who were on the table discussing it had brought this different interpretation. And clearly it's a product of this contestation, the South Africa's framework. I mean, then there's the question of whether the communities were involved in the drafting of this. Again, people have different views. First thing that we need to say is that in the Presidential Climate Commission, PCC, you have, although they are there in their individual capacities, you have people who are leaders in climate justice movements. When it was started, we had 4 active trade unionists. So I'm not sure about the contribution of these people, but they are in the Presidential Climate Commission, which came up with the framework. And there were public hearings that were organized. Yeah, I mean, there's always whether these public hearings, how deep did they go? Who did they cover? Were they just tick box exercises? But I think it will be sort of unfair to say, look, oh, this was all imposed from above.
The question that we tried to unpack in episode 2 with Dinga is South Africa's strategy of energy transition through green hydrogen. We delve deeper into questions of industrial strategy and what needs to be done to ensure that communities are not left behind. This podcast series, produced in partnership with Action Aid International, is available in our website at www.makua.org.za and wherever you find your podcast. Do follow Makua Wamua on social media for more content on the work we do. I am your host, Musa Sikwebu. Take care.